The message that ended my marriage arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in my backyard watering the roses my husband once said were his favorite. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a small ordinary sound that should have meant nothing, but when I pulled it out and read the words on the screen, the world around me seemed to fall strangely quiet. "I'm taking Lily instead," my husband Daniel had written. "Don't wait up." For a long moment, I simply stared at the message, reading it once, then again, as if the meaning might somehow rearrange itself into something less cruel. The sprinkler clicked slowly across the lawn, the late afternoon sun stretching across the wooden fence, and somewhere down the street a dog barked. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier, except my 42-year marriage had just ended in 14 careless words. I wish I could say I cried right then, or that I called him and demanded an explanation. That might have been the expected reaction, but the truth is something inside me went very still. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, turned off the water hose, and stood there quietly among the roses that suddenly didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. Daniel and I had lived in that house for almost 3 decades. It was a wide 2-story colonial on Maple Ridge Drive with white shutters and a long driveway that curved past an old oak tree. We bought it when our son Michael was in middle school, back when Daniel was still the kind of man who held my hand in grocery stores and insisted on fixing every broken hinge himself. Over the years we painted every room together, replaced the roof after a heavy storm, and planted the very roses now blooming along the fence. At least, I had believed we did those things together. Looking back, I realize I was the one holding everything steady while Daniel slowly drifted somewhere else. The first time I met Lily Harper was at one of Daniel's company events about 2 years earlier. She worked in marketing, younger than our son, bright smile, expensive shoes, the kind of person who laughed a little too hard at every joke Daniel told. I remember noticing how she touched his arm when she spoke, how easily she leaned into his space. At the time I brushed it away. After 40 years of marriage, you learn not to suspect shadows where there might be none. Besides, Daniel had always told me I worried too much. But standing there in the backyard with that message glowing in my memory, something uncomfortable finally settled into place. The late meetings, the sudden business trips, the way Daniel had stopped asking about my day months ago. The signs had been there. I simply chose not to see them. I walked back inside the house slowly, setting the watering can beside the kitchen sink. The house felt quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet I used to love. This was the quiet of something already finished. I picked up my phone again and read the message one more time. "I'm taking Lily instead." He didn't even try to hide it. No apology. No explanation. Just a simple update, as if he were telling me he'd chosen a different restaurant for dinner. A strange calm settled over me then. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Just clarity. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and typed a single question into the search bar. How quickly can a house be sold in Illinois? The answer appeared in less than a second. And for the first time since reading Daniel's message, I smiled. The house felt different that evening, as if it already knew something I had not fully allowed myself to say out loud. I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun disappeared behind the oak tree in the driveway, the soft glow of the overhead light reflecting against the polished wood surface Daniel and I had picked out together 27 years earlier. The laptop screen was still open in front of me, the search results quietly explaining the process of selling property in Illinois, each line of text calm and practical in a way that almost felt comforting. Real estate timelines, closing periods, market demand. Everything was written in the neutral language of business, as if the end of a life could be reduced to paperwork and signatures. I read every word slowly. If the home was properly priced, the article said, it could sell within days in the right market. Maple Ridge Drive was exactly the kind of neighborhood buyers liked. Quiet streets, strong schools, well-maintained houses. The sort of place families fought to move into. I leaned back in my chair and glanced around the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The clock above the stove ticked towards 7 in the evening. Daniel would not notice the difference tonight. According to his message, he was busy choosing someone else. I stood and walked through the house one room at a time, not because I was emotional, but because I wanted to see it clearly. The living room still held the cream-colored sofa we bought after Michael graduated from college. The hallway photographs showed the same smiling family frozen in time. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, beach vacations along Lake Michigan. In every picture, Daniel had his arm around my shoulder, smiling like a man who believed exactly where he belonged. I stopped in front of one photograph taken 15 years earlier during a summer barbecue. Daniel was standing beside me with a plate in his hand, laughing at something our neighbor had said. That version of him looked like a stranger now. Somewhere along the way, the man in that picture had quietly disappeared, replaced by someone who could send 14 words and erase decades. I continued upstairs and paused in the doorway of our bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the navy blue comforter pulled tight the way I always kept it. Daniel had not slept there the last 3 nights, though he told me he was traveling for work in Indianapolis. At the time, I believed him. Now the empty side of the bed felt less like a mystery and more like an answer. I opened the closet and looked at the row of his shirts hanging beside mine. Business suits, golf jackets, the gray coat he wore every winter. None of them meant anything to me anymore. Downstairs, the phone vibrated again on the kitchen counter. For a moment, I wondered if Daniel had written something else, perhaps a careless apology or a correction he believed would soften the message. When I picked up the phone, however, the notification came from a real estate website responding to the information request I had submitted 20 minutes earlier. A local agent named Karen Whitfield had already sent a short message offering to discuss the market value of my property whenever it was convenient. I read the message carefully, then placed the phone back on the counter and poured myself a glass of iced tea. The calm feeling returned, stronger now. Daniel thought he had surprised me today. He thought he had already decided the future of our marriage, our home, our life. What he did not understand was that the house on Maple Ridge Drive had never been his to begin with. My father left me the inheritance that paid for most of it when we bought the property all those years ago. At the time, Daniel joked that I had been the smart investor in the family. The paperwork had always remained in my name because it seemed simpler that way. I took a slow sip of the tea and looked around the quiet kitchen again. For the first time all evening, the house did not feel like a memory. It felt like an opportunity. Tomorrow morning, I would call Karen Whitfield. And by the time Daniel returned from wherever he had decided to spend the week, Maple Ridge Drive might already belong to someone else. The next morning arrived quietly, the way ordinary mornings always do, even when something extraordinary has already begun. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds and stretched across the floor in long pale stripes, while the coffee maker hummed softly beside the sink. I woke earlier than usual, not because I felt anxious, but because my mind had already moved forward while the rest of the world was still catching up. For the first time in years, I did not check my phone to see if Daniel had sent another message. The silence from him felt almost expected now, like background noise fading away. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the same kitchen table where I had searched for real estate information the night before. The house felt peaceful in a way it had not felt for months. Without Daniel's presence, the room seemed calmer, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to make a decision. At exactly 9 o'clock, I picked up my phone and called the number Karen Whitfield had left in her message. She answered on the second ring with the confident, warm voice of someone who had spent years helping people move from one chapter of their lives into another. I introduced myself and told her I lived on Maple Ridge Drive and that I was interested in understanding the value of my home. She did not ask many personal questions. Experienced agents rarely do at the beginning. Instead, she asked about the square footage, the number of bedrooms, the condition of the roof, and the last time the kitchen had been renovated. I answered calmly, walking slowly through the house while we spoke. 2,600 square feet. 4 bedrooms. 3 bathrooms. Hardwood floors in the living room and hallway. The roof had been replaced 6 years earlier after a heavy storm rolled through the county. When I mentioned the quiet street and the elementary school only half a mile away, Karen paused for a moment and then said something that made me smile slightly. She told me homes in our neighborhood had been selling quickly, sometimes within a single week if they were priced correctly. Families were always looking for houses exactly like mine. When the call ended, she asked if she could stop by later that afternoon to see the property in person and give me a more accurate estimate. I agreed without hesitation. After I set the phone down, I began walking through the house again. But this time I was not looking at memories. I was looking at details. The condition of the cabinets. The sunlight in the dining room. The way the staircase curved gently toward the second floor. Real estate agents notice those things, and so do buyers. Around noon, Karen Whitfield's silver sedan rolled slowly into the driveway beneath the oak tree. She stepped out carrying a slim leather folder and greeted me with the easy professionalism of someone who understood that selling a home was rarely just a financial decision. We walked through every room together while she took notes and occasionally measured the walls with a small digital device. She complimented the natural light in the living room and the size of the backyard. When we reached the kitchen, she ran her hand along the countertop and said the house had clearly been well cared for. I simply nodded. When the tour finished, we sat at the dining table while she opened her folder and showed me a series of recent sales in the neighborhood. The numbers were higher than I expected. According to her analysis, the property could attract serious buyers very quickly if it entered the market within the week. I looked down at the photographs and price comparisons spread across the table and felt that same calm clarity return. Daniel believed he would come home to the life he had left behind. But as Karen Whitfield gathered her papers and asked whether I wished to move forward with the listing, I realized something important. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was no longer part of the life I intended to keep. After Karen Whitfield left that afternoon, the house felt quieter than it ever had before, but it was not an empty kind of quiet. It felt like the calm pause that comes just before something begins moving forward. I stood by the living room window for a long moment watching the sunlight stretch across Maple Ridge Drive, while children rode bicycles past the mailbox at the corner. Life in the neighborhood continued exactly as it always had, unaware that the house behind the white shutters had just entered a new chapter. On the dining table, Karen had left a simple listing agreement along with a folder explaining the next steps. I read every page slowly, not because the language was complicated, but because each sentence made the decision feel more real. Photographs would be taken. The listing would appear online within 24 hours. Buyers would begin scheduling visits almost immediately. It was all very organized, very professional, and surprisingly fast. I signed the agreement with a steady hand. Once the ink dried, I placed the document neatly back into the folder and set it near the edge of the table. The moment felt strangely peaceful. Instead of feeling like I was losing something, it felt as if I had quietly reclaimed control of my own story. That evening I began doing something I had not done in years. I walked through each room and started sorting the things that truly belonged to me. The process was not emotional the way people often imagine when they hear about someone packing up a life. It was calm and deliberate. In the bedroom closet, I separated my clothes from Daniel's suits and jackets, placing mine carefully into 2 large travel cases. His clothing remained hanging exactly where he left it. In the hallway cabinet, I gathered the photo albums that documented our son Michael's childhood. Those memories still mattered, and they would come with me wherever I went next. In the kitchen, I packed a small box with the dishes my mother gave me when Daniel and I were first married. The house itself had been purchased with my inheritance from my father, something Daniel had always treated as a convenient detail rather than an important fact. For years it never mattered who technically owned the property. Marriage had always meant sharing everything. But now that quiet detail had become the one thing Daniel never expected. The following morning, Karen called to tell me the listing had already gone live online and that the response from potential buyers was stronger than she predicted. Several families wanted to see the property before the weekend. She sounded pleasantly surprised, but I was not. Maple Ridge Drive had always been a desirable place to live, and the photographs she posted made the house look bright and welcoming. As the week moved forward, the schedule quickly filled with appointments. Each afternoon, Karen arrived with interested buyers who walked through the rooms politely, speaking in quiet voices about the backyard, the kitchen layout, and the school district nearby. I greeted them warmly and answered simple questions, never mentioning the reason behind the sale. To them, it was simply another house on the market. By Thursday evening, Karen called again with news that a young couple relocating from Milwaukee had made a serious offer. They loved the property and wanted to move quickly. The price they proposed was not only fair, it was higher than what Karen had initially estimated. When she asked how I wished to proceed, I looked around the quiet living room one more time. The decision did not take long. I told her to accept the offer and begin the closing process immediately. Daniel had no idea that every day he spent away from Maple Ridge Drive brought him closer to a house that would soon belong to someone else. By Friday morning, the house on Maple Ridge Drive no longer felt like a place I was living in. It felt more like a quiet stage after the final scene of a long play. The offer from the couple in Milwaukee had been accepted, and Karen Whitfield had already begun preparing the paperwork for the closing. Everything was moving forward quickly, exactly the way she predicted it would. When I woke that morning, the sunlight filled the kitchen again, warming the same wooden table where Daniel and I once sat together, drinking coffee before work. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember those mornings clearly. Daniel reading the newspaper, the smell of toast in the toaster, the comfortable routine that used to define our lives. But memories have a way of becoming lighter once you understand they belong to the past. I poured a cup of coffee and opened my laptop to review the documents Karen had sent overnight. The purchase agreement was straightforward. The buyers were eager to move before the end of the month, and because the property had been well maintained, the inspection period would be brief. If everything continued smoothly, the closing could happen in less than 2 weeks. I read the timeline twice and then closed the computer gently. Daniel had been gone for 4 days now. There had been no messages from him since the short text that ended everything. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. Somewhere he was enjoying the freedom he believed he had chosen. What he did not realize was that time was quietly changing the foundation beneath his feet. Later that afternoon, Karen stopped by again with additional paperwork that required my signature. She looked pleased when she stepped inside the living room, as if she could already sense how easily the property would transfer to its new owners. We sat at the dining table while she explained each document carefully. Property disclosures, title verification, the schedule for the inspection and appraisal. The process sounded very technical, but in truth it felt simple. Each signature moved the house one step closer to belonging to someone else. When we finished, she gathered the papers neatly and paused for a moment before leaving. She asked whether I had already arranged my own next move. I told her I had been quietly preparing for that as well. 2 days earlier, I had reserved a furnished apartment near Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. It was smaller than the house, but the building overlooked the water and the lease allowed flexible terms. For the first time in years, the future felt open rather than predictable. Karen smiled warmly and said many people discovered unexpected freedom after making difficult decisions. When she drove away, I walked through the house one more time with a small notebook in my hand, listing the few remaining items I wanted to take with me. The photo albums were already packed. My clothes and personal papers were organized beside the front hallway. Everything else could remain behind. Daniel's golf clubs still stood in the corner of the garage. His winter coat still hung in the closet near the stairs. I left them exactly where they were. That evening I stood on the front porch watching the sky darken above the quiet street. A soft breeze moved through the oak tree while the porch light cast a gentle circle on the driveway. I wondered briefly when Daniel planned to return. Perhaps he imagined walking through the front door sometime next week, suitcase in hand, expecting life to continue exactly where he left it. The thought did not upset me. Instead, it felt almost distant, like a story that no longer belonged to me. Inside the house, the rooms were nearly empty of my presence now. Only the walls remained, waiting for the final steps that would officially pass them to new owners. Somewhere in another city, Daniel was living a version of the future he believed he had chosen. What he did not understand was that Maple Ridge Drive was already becoming part of someone else's beginning. Saturday morning arrived with a soft gray sky and the quiet feeling of a neighborhood slowly waking up. Maple Ridge Drive looked exactly the same as it always had. The same mailboxes lined the sidewalks. The same oak tree stretched its wide branches over the driveway. The same houses stood neatly in rows like they had for decades. But inside number 17, everything had already changed. I woke early again, not out of worry, but because there was still a list of final tasks waiting for me. The inspection for the buyers had been scheduled for that afternoon, and Karen Whitfield had called the night before to confirm that everything was moving forward exactly as planned. If the inspection went smoothly, the closing date would likely be finalized within a few days. That meant the house would officially belong to someone else sooner than anyone expected. I moved quietly through the kitchen, placing the last few dishes I planned to take into a small box beside the door. The rest of the cabinets were already empty. When I opened the refrigerator, there was almost nothing left inside except a carton of milk and a small container of fruit. It felt strange, seeing the kitchen this bare, but not in a sad way. It felt organized, like the final step of a project that had been carefully planned. Around 10 o'clock, Karen arrived with the home inspector, a polite man named Thomas who carried a clipboard and a small flashlight. He walked through the property slowly, checking electrical outlets, running water from the faucets, and examining the roof from the backyard. I followed quietly behind, while Karen waited near the front door, answering a few emails on her phone. The inspection took nearly 2 hours, but when Thomas finally returned to the living room, his expression looked satisfied. He explained that the house had been maintained very well over the years, and that he did not expect any serious issues in the report. The buyers, he added, would likely feel confident moving forward. Karen gave me a quick smile that confirmed the same thought. After they left, the house felt even quieter than before. I stood for a moment in the empty living room listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner. Only a few pieces of furniture remained now, and most of them were scheduled to be collected by a small moving company the following morning. My suitcases and personal boxes were already waiting in the hallway near the front door. Later that afternoon, I drove into Chicago to see the apartment I had rented near Lakeshore Drive. The building stood 20 stories tall, overlooking Lake Michigan, and when the leasing manager opened the balcony door, the cool wind from the water filled the small living room with fresh air. It was not a large place, but the view of the lake stretched far beyond the horizon, and the quiet sound of the waves felt calming in a way I had not experienced in years. For the first time since Daniel's message arrived, I allowed myself to imagine life somewhere completely different. That evening, as I drove back to Maple Ridge Drive for what would likely be my final night in the house, my phone vibrated for the first time in nearly a week. When I glanced at the screen, I saw Daniel's name appear across the message notification. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I parked in the driveway beneath the old oak tree and sat there quietly for a moment, watching the porch light glow against the front door. Somewhere far away, Daniel was finally reaching out again, unaware that the home he believed was waiting for him was already preparing to belong to someone else. The message from Daniel remained on my phone screen while I sat in the quiet driveway beneath the oak tree. The porch light glowed softly against the front of the house, casting a warm circle over the steps that I had walked up thousands of times over the years. For a moment, I simply looked at his name on the screen without opening the message. After nearly a week of silence, whatever he had written now could not change the direction things were already moving. Eventually, I unlocked the phone and read the text. Daniel wrote that he would be coming home the following evening. He said the trip had taken longer than expected and that he wanted to talk when he returned. There was no apology in the message, and there was no explanation. The words sounded casual, almost ordinary, as if he believed everything was still waiting for him exactly where he had left it. I set the phone down on the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The evening air was cool and quiet, carrying the faint smell of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the street. Inside the house, the rooms felt even emptier than the night before. Most of the remaining furniture had already been scheduled for pickup early the next morning, and my personal boxes were stacked neatly beside the front door. I walked slowly through each room one final time. The living room echoed slightly now when I stepped across the hardwood floor. The kitchen counters were clear except for the coffee maker I planned to take with me. Even the bedroom upstairs had been stripped down to little more than the bed frame and 2 lamps on the nightstands. I stood by the bedroom window for a moment, looking out at the quiet street below. For years, I believed this house represented stability. It held birthdays, holidays, and ordinary evenings that once felt permanent. Now it simply felt like a place that had served its purpose. The next morning, the moving company arrived exactly at 8 o'clock. 2 men in a white truck carefully loaded the remaining furniture and my suitcases into the back while I signed a short inventory form on a clipboard. By 9:30, the truck pulled away, leaving the house almost completely empty. Only the echo of footsteps remained when I walked through the rooms. Around midday, Karen Whitfield called with another update. The inspection report had come back clean, and the buyers were ready to finalize the closing early the following week. Everything was proceeding faster than anyone originally expected. When I thanked her for the update, she laughed softly and said houses like this rarely stayed on the market for long. That afternoon, I drove into Chicago again and signed the lease for the apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The leasing manager handed me the keys in a small envelope and explained that I could move in immediately if I wished. I placed the envelope in my purse and stepped out onto the balcony for a moment. The lake stretched across the horizon in long blue waves, reflecting the afternoon sunlight in a way that made the entire city feel brighter. Later that evening, I returned once more to Maple Ridge Drive to collect the final box waiting near the door. The house was silent now, completely empty, the way houses often are just before they change owners. I placed the box in my car and took one last look through the open doorway. Somewhere on the road, Daniel was already making his way back, believing he would soon walk through that same front door. But by the time he arrived tomorrow, Maple Ridge Drive would no longer be the home he remembered. The next day, the house on Maple Ridge Drive officially stopped belonging to my life, even if the paperwork would not be finalized until a few days later. Early that morning, I drove back to the neighborhood one last time, not because I needed anything from the house, but because Karen Whitfield had asked me to meet the buyers for a brief walkthrough before they prepared for closing. The sky was clear and bright, and the quiet street looked exactly the way it always had on a calm Sunday morning. When I pulled into the driveway, however, the house felt different from the moment I stepped out of the car. It no longer felt like mine. The front door was already open when I walked up the steps. Karen stood inside speaking with the young couple who had made the offer earlier that week. They greeted me politely, their excitement visible in the way they glanced around the living room. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca and explained that she and her husband had been searching for a home near the elementary school for months. She told me they loved the backyard and the large kitchen windows. Listening to her speak about the house reminded me that places like this are rarely permanent for anyone. They simply move from one family to another, carrying different stories with them each time. We walked slowly through the empty rooms together. Without furniture, the house felt larger, the hardwood floors reflecting the sunlight that streamed through the windows. Rebecca stood for a moment in the kitchen, smiling as she imagined where her dining table would go. Her husband stepped outside to look at the oak tree in the yard, already discussing where they might build a small garden. Their excitement felt genuine, and I realized that the house was about to begin a completely new chapter with people who would fill it with their own memories. Karen confirmed a few final details about the closing schedule while we stood near the staircase. Everything was proceeding smoothly. The title documents had already been prepared, and the transfer would happen early the following week. After a few more minutes, the couple thanked me for maintaining the property so well over the years. I wished them happiness in the home and stepped outside to give them time to explore the rooms again. As I walked back toward my car, I glanced once more at the white shutters and the front porch that had once felt so familiar. But the sense of attachment that used to live in those details had quietly disappeared. Later that afternoon, I was already back in Chicago, standing on the balcony of the apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The wind from the water moved gently across the lake, while small boats drifted in the distance. I had just finished unpacking the last of my personal belongings when my phone vibrated again on the small kitchen counter. Daniel's name appeared on the screen for the second time in 2 days. This time I opened the message immediately. He wrote that he had arrived back in town earlier than expected and was driving toward the house on Maple Ridge Drive. He said he hoped we could talk when he got there. I read the message slowly, then placed the phone back on the counter without answering. Several hundred miles away, the house he believed was waiting for him now belonged to someone else's future. As the evening sunlight reflected across the surface of the lake, I realized there was nothing left for me to explain. The sun was beginning to set over Lake Michigan when my phone vibrated again on the kitchen counter. The light outside the balcony window had turned soft and golden, reflecting across the water in long, quiet streaks. I had spent most of the afternoon arranging the last of my belongings in the apartment. The place was smaller than the house on Maple Ridge Drive, but it felt open in a way that surprised me. Without the weight of old routines, even the quiet rooms felt full of possibility. When the phone buzzed again, I already knew who it would be. Daniel had arrived. The message was longer this time. He wrote that he was standing in front of the house, and something was wrong. He said the driveway looked different, and the living room windows were empty. Then another message appeared only seconds later. He asked why there was a moving truck parked nearby, and why strangers were inside the house. I stood by the balcony railing looking out at the lake while I read the messages slowly. Hundreds of miles away, Daniel was finally seeing what had changed during the days he spent away. The house on Maple Ridge Drive no longer belonged to the life he thought he was returning to. A few moments passed before another message appeared on the screen. Daniel wrote that he had knocked on the door and a young couple answered. They told him they had just purchased the property and were preparing to move their things inside. His words grew shorter after that. Confused questions replaced the calm tone he used before. He asked what was happening and why the house had been sold. For a moment, I imagined the scene clearly. Daniel standing on the front porch beneath the old oak tree. The same porch where we once welcomed neighbors for summer dinners. The same doorway he walked through thousands of times without ever wondering whether it would always be there. The difference now was simple. The house had never truly belonged to him. It had always been mine, purchased years earlier with the inheritance my father left me. At the time, Daniel laughed about it, calling me the smartest investor in the family. Neither of us imagined that quiet detail would someday matter. But life has a way of revealing the meaning behind things we once ignored. My phone vibrated again as Daniel sent another message asking where I was and why I had not told him anything. The questions sounded urgent now, but they no longer carried the power they once might have had. I placed the phone down on the small kitchen table and stepped outside onto the balcony. The evening wind moved gently across the water, carrying the distant sound of waves against the shore below. The city lights were beginning to appear along the skyline, glowing softly as the sky darkened above the lake. For the first time in many years, I felt completely calm about the future. After a while, I returned inside and picked up the phone again. Daniel had sent one last message asking me to call him. Instead, I typed a short reply and read it once before sending it. I wrote that he had made his choice when he decided to build a new life somewhere else. I wrote that the house had simply followed the same path and moved on without him. Then I placed the phone face down on the counter and stepped back onto the balcony. The wind off the lake felt cool and steady against my face. Somewhere far away on Maple Ridge Drive, Daniel was finally realizing that the life he walked away from had quietly closed its door behind him.